Okay, welcome everyone. Let's go to the next slide, please. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for this webinar about best practices in accelerating successful regulatory innovation. The topic is regulatory innovation. I'm the moderator, Tom Stanton, a principal researcher at National Regulatory Research Institute. And we have 4 expert presenters with us today from 3 different jurisdictions that are engaged in regulatory innovation in important ways. We'll hear in order from Hawaii, and then District of Columbia, and then Connecticut. And they're in that order in part because of the long history of these activities in Hawaii and a fairly long history also in District of Columbia, and then the more recent activities in Connecticut. So that's why we put them in that order. And then we'll hear a wrap up from former Commissioner Brian Sheehan from the Illinois Commerce Commission and former chair of the NARUC Presidential Task Force on Innovation. Let's go to the next slide, please. If you have questions anytime during the session, please send them using the Q&A tab in the Zoom menu options. If you have any technical issues that are coming up, you can send them in the chat for us to try to address them. And I do want to thank the entire NRI team that is making today's webinar possible. Next, please. I'm going to give a very brief innovation about this topic. And we all, I think, have a grasp of the general topic of innovation. I wanted you to note that this is so important that the United States Postal Service has even issued a set of postage stamps to honor and represent innovation. The dictionary talks about those particular definitions that are at the bottom of this slide. And let's go to the next slide. Here you see some of the preliminary discussion about what it means to think about and talk about regulatory innovation. And the first bullet point talks about the idea that recently many state legislators and governors are assigning new missions and new objectives to utility regulatory commissions. One of the recent research papers calls those transformational values, like climate action, equity, and environmental justice, that they may have always been part of the agenda of regulatory commissions, but there's new emphasis sometimes, and sometimes new directives to make those different values very important in regulatory decision-making. We will hear later from former Commissioner Sheehan, and he wrote a very recent good article in Utility Dive, and I drew this quotation from that article that he's talking about the need for new regulatory tools, and that the regulatory process can make it very difficult to achieve the kind of pace of change that utilities are facing today. Finally, the bottom quote here is from the Organization of Economic Cooperative Countries. It includes 38 countries, including the US, and they have issued a report about innovation and talk about what innovation means, and noting that the presumed goal of that innovation is implementation of new technologies and putting them into use, making them available for others to use for the purpose of value creation. Let's go to the next, please. These 2 maps just show an indication of where such changes are underway today. Many states on the left side map issuing very strong proclamations about global climate change and very strong renewable energy or clean energy portfolio standards. And on the right, the many states that have recent actions about adding equity and decarbonization in the goals for their regulatory commissions. Next, please. Here I've just provided a list of some of the many United States Department of Energy and National Laboratories innovation initiatives. And I won't try to go through all these with you today, but take a look at all those links later and follow to learn about what all these different activities are that are underway. Many of these focus more on the technical issues involved with innovating and new technologies, but some do also touch on regulatory innovation, and that is the main subject for our work here. I am working on a research paper for NRRI on that subject. And so I invite all of the states, after you hear today's presentation, to contact me and let me know about your activities in your state. You'll see kind of little sketches from the 3 states that are giving us information today. And then I'm going to try to replicate that in miniature case studies about these activities in many states. So I don't want to leave anyone out. If you have important things going on in your state, I'm interested to learn what they are and get the documentation. Next, please. Again, here are the innovations platforms of the different trade industry associations. And again, you can see that there's important activity along these lines from Electric Power Research Institute, Gas Technology Institute, the Water Innovation and Water Research, and then the overall American Energy Innovation Council. Next. This brand new report just came out and a few weeks ago that talks about the innovation hubs all over the country. The size of those circles on the map represents the size of that activity in states. And as you can see, there are many institutions that are working on innovation all over the country. Next. So from the regulatory standpoint, we look for these 4 fundamental services, and this is gleaned from literature on the topic. At the end of this presentation, you'll see some reading list that would lead you to the sources for this kind of detail. Having an innovation hub means making certain there's a way for stakeholders to communicate openly with one another and talk about possible innovations. The inquiry service refers explicitly to the idea that innovators are able to go to a regulatory commission and discuss their new idea for an innovation, either technological or business model, and then get help understanding how that might apply and how it might be affected under the existing rules and regulations, and whether some kind of an experiment or a trial is needed to prove the technology and prove the market model, and then get ready for broader implementation. The third topic here, regulatory trials, means those experiments. And there's an implication in these discussions in many countries, and also now in some states, that there may have to be some flexibility about existing regulatory rules while such trials are underway, that there may be a need for something like a waiver or a letter that indicates that no action will be taken while the trial is underway. The final point here is that these systems are designed so that once activities take place under those first 3 kinds of functions or services, there's a built-in system for making certain that there could be regulatory and policy learning coming from those activities. Next, please. These activities typically include these 4 features, and they're kind of simple to understand, I hope. Public announcement of the activity under oversight and supervision by a regulatory agency. This process of planning experiments and trying to make those experiments rapid and small enough so that if there are any kinds of failures, the risks are rather low. And then during the process of working on the planned experiments, making sure there are action plans so that with successes, people are ready for broader implementation of the new technologies or business models. And if there are less than satisfactory outcomes, some kind of an exit strategy for how to, not have a problem caused by this activity and be ready to move on to the next idea for next innovation. Next. So they platforms that are going on around the country and around other countries also differ in these 5 different dimensions. Who's eligible to apply and participate? What's that schedule like? And is the timing of opportunity for participation fixed with one particular time per year, or a particular call for specific kinds of innovation, or is it more open-ended? And what are the sources of the initial ideas for doing innovation? Does it come from the regulator themselves? Does it come from the industry? Or is it coming from the innovators who are identifying these topics? What is the legal framework, and the how active is the regulator's participation? May the regulator allow flexibility and loosen or waive existing rules during the trials? And then the final point here, how transparent is the platform? Does the platform itself allow for observation and review by all interested parties? And to what extent must the innovators publicly divulge intellectual property in order to participate? That could be a big barrier to getting the innovators to participate. So with that introduction, now we're going to start turning our attention to case studies. Would you go to the next slide, please? And our first case study is coming from Hawaii. Mr. Glick is a faculty member at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he's an energy policy and innovation specialist working for the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute. The Natural Energy Institute is housed at that university. Mr. Glick was previously administrator of the Hawaii State Energy Office, and he also served as vice chair of the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NACIO. He's had a very deep experience in this field and has written a very important paper about the innovation practices in Hawaii. And I've asked all the presenters to let me know what it is that they're doing special during the COVID pandemic. And Mark has told me that he's been trying to plant native koa trees in the mountainous areas near where he lives. So I want to welcome you, Mark, and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate you and NRRI for putting forth this really important discussion on innovation, regulatory innovation, and thank you for having me. Sometimes I wish all I was doing was clearing trees and letting the koa sprout up on the mountainous area where we live in Hawaii, but unfortunately we have to work on energy transition. So I'm going to talk about what Hawaii has done over the last few years and some contributions we may have made to regulatory innovation. Next slide, please. Just give you a little brief background on the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute that Tom had mentioned, where I am currently. We're an organized research unit of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, particularly our School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology. And we have a whole set of scientists and engineers, lawyers, students, and graduate research students, postdocs. And we typically have 70 to 80 people on staff working on primarily energy transition. And you can see from the graphic, we kind of view ourselves as a key part of the Hawaii energy transformation. We were established in statute in 2007 to actually lead the technology and analysis side of the energy transition. And we work very closely with the Public Utilities Commission and the State Energy Office, where I came from. And I mentioned that two of the three Hawaii PUC commissioners that are currently in place were hired from HNEI. So obviously we there's a lot of, I guess, joint activity going on. Next slide, please. The perspective that I like to use and that I think has grown some popularity in Hawaii is to look at, from a contextual standpoint, a multi-level perspective. How does the energy transition fit into the overall governance and activity that goes on at a global level, which you can refer to as landscape, which tends to be a little bit more static. It's really difficult to move, but when it does, it really has power. Obviously, all of the international work, when China and the United States get involved in innovation and research efforts that lead to massive improvements or increases in renewable energy, PV and storage costs that are reduced significantly, it has a whole impact on the entire energy economy and the movement, and we're all benefactors of that. At the regime level, that's obviously our federal policies, and typically it's the corporate culture and shifts that that really do provide the overall balance of the system. And at the niche level, that's where the action happens. The localities and often the Public Utilities Commissions are providing orders and guidance that really move small players in the industry to make massive changes that do percolate back up to the regime level. So in the next slide, we'll take a look at essentially how this may fit on the local level. In Hawaii, our comprehensive energy transition approach really had several drivers from the beginning. The Renewable Portfolio Standard in 2008, that was 40% renewable by 2030. We, of course, increased that in 2015, became the first state in the nation to pass a mandatory 100% binding RPS. But obviously, you have to reduce efficiency. You have to increase efficiency and reduce demand, and that really helps us meet our RPS goals. We did that through Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard. Most of the action truly is in the regulatory stage. The oversight agency for the electricity sector, of course, the Public Utilities Commission. In transportation, it's a much more distributed system. There's no single manager or oversight agency, so that's much more difficult. Obviously, many players have really focused on the electricity sector because it's much more manageable in that sense. Obviously, analysis and scenarios, planning, design, technical assistance is so critical as you move forward and you begin to deploy. And deployment, of course, is where the innovation percolates. And we'll talk a little bit about how the increased demand for renewables actually forced us into innovation. Next slide, please. At the niche level in Hawaii, we obviously were able to see a lot of activity that ultimately I think were huge movers in sort of improving the situation. And it began, I think, and what you'll often hear public utilities commissioners in Hawaii talk about was something called Inclinations on the Future of Hawaii's Electric Utilities. And truly that activity or that order in 2014 was to align the utility business model with customer interests. And it came purely out of frustration with the IRP process, which took over 2 years, had probably over 70 interveners, and had so many different scenarios without any preferred action offered that it was rejected by the Public Utilities Commission. And I'm talking about Hawaiian Electric Utilities, Hawaiian Electric Company, HECO, its IRP. It was rejected in 2014. Inclinations was essentially an attempt to provide guidance. It also, in a sense, took apart the IRP process and created multiple guidance pieces, a distributed generation interconnection plan, a power supply improvement plan. These were all essentially subparts of an IRP that were now taken apart, and the utility was asked to create specific plans. And the Public Utilities Commission didn't give them much time. Gave them actually 4 months to begin putting these things together. And it dealt with, again, 3 parts: the generation picture as they articulated 21st century generation plan, grid modernization, and then, of course, the policy and regulatory reforms. And I'll focus mostly on that. But again, it was something that truly on the regulatory reform side probably set the stage for the performance-based regulation docket that came up after that and that was ultimately adopted. Next slide, please. So another thing that I think occurred, and I think it's mutually supportive. So it's not simply a matter of commissions moving forward on providing guidance and sort of forcing action, or at least minding the action and making sure that it's positive and appropriate. There also, I think, needs to be stakeholder alliances that open transparency in the process, and that also give the ability to be able to forge consensus. We had 2 such organizations, one that was formed in 2002, a full 6 years before the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, which I'll talk about after. But the Energy Policy Forum came out of the University of Hawaii at Manoa and was really established to help the siting process, which had grown contentious. But it also gave the opportunity to really focus on what needed to be done to make energy transition improvements. And I think a key accomplishment was setting up the PUC Special Fund and setting up the appropriate amount of funding to allow the Public Utilities Commission and the Consumer Advocate to have enough staff to do critical analysis and to weigh in appropriately on all the dockets that and measures that needed to be taken on. By 2008, an energy agreement was signed between the U.S. Department of Energy and the state of Hawaii at the executive branch by the governor. And that set essentially a framework of objectives and basically laws and regulations that would be pursued over the ensuing years. The very next year, the 40% RPS and the EEPS were passed into law. And again, by having a broad coalition to come in and support this. And then in the electricity sector, HCI was essentially I think, a very powerful player that we used when I was energy administrator to push for the 100% renewable portfolio standard. Next slide. But I want to emphasize that it's more than just simply a set of laws and regulations, these programs. They really are a stakeholder alliance. And essentially those two come together. So when I look at how did inclinations affect the mindset of the utility, of the Public Utilities Commission in trying to drive action at the utility, one example, again, more of a case study, is the community-based renewable energy bill that we passed at the same time that we passed the 100% renewable portfolio standard. We also passed the CBRE bill. And what we saw during the passage of that was the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission take an active role in the passage of that legislation. Typically, utility commissions haven't been engaged as think aggressively, and they're very careful. And in this case, as I'll discuss, there was a lot of collaboration, but clearly having something that would provide greater equity in terms of rooftop solar and or at least in terms of utility scale solar, but allow essentially that for those that were unable to get rooftop solar, like renters, to be able to participate through CBRE programs. The commission thought that was totally consistent with the inclinations paper that it had issued the previous year. And they also gave further guidance about being able to have the discretion to revise and modify the program in statute. That should be left to the commission. So there shouldn't be prescriptive language in that law. So that all came from the chairman of the PUC. Initially, those comments were done primarily through their discussion with staff, and they just issued testimony to that proceeding. Now, when we go to the next slide, you can see that as that proceeded, that went from Ways and Means, and then we cross over to the other, to the House Finance Committee. And when it got to the Finance Committee, again, Randy Iwasi, who was the chair of the Hawaii PUC at the time, weighed in again. He also reiterated that this CBRE bill is totally consistent with inclinations on the future of Hawaii's electric utilities, but and it does give the discretion. The bill was amended to allow the PUC to set and revise and modify the details of the program, but it also had consulted with our office, the Hawaii State Energy Office, which resided in the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, as well as Blue Planet Foundation, which was a leading not-for-profit organization led by Hank Rogers, who owns Tetris. He had formed Blue Planet to really work towards 100% renewable portfolio standard, and they were a key ally for us in passing this legislation. And again, there were discussions with PUC staff during the course of this to be able to set the stage for this particular policy. So I thought that was, that was perhaps the first time that we ever worked that closely together. And again, I think that came directly from their feelings that they needed to be more involved, that they set forth in inclinations. Next slide, please. I sort of want to wrap up and talk a little bit about how these regulations evolved, not only with experience, but out of necessity. When we overheated the market for rooftop solar in Hawaii, meaning that rooftop solar doubled from 2010 to 2011, and then it doubled again from 2011 to 2012, and then again more than that from 2012 to 2013. During that time, hard to believe, but rooftop solar was nearly 20%, nearly 30% of all new construction in the state of Hawaii in 2013. So it was an extremely robust period. The evolution of interconnection rules, there was such a backlog of that. And of course, with new inverters to be able to manage it, dealing with the massive problem that we were beginning to have to manage transient over voltage, really caused us to change the NEM program. And so the Public Utilities Commission decided that they were going to have essentially what they called smart export of PV, and basically ended the NEM program at full retail, and then came up with new tariffs and also with controls to be able to better manage that. And another innovation that I think is extremely important was that's really been very helpful to Hawaiian Electric and to Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, our other major utility, is the expedited implementation process for new technologies, programs, and business models. And essentially that gives discretion of up to $10 million a year for selected projects that really don't require significant commission oversight. So there's essentially a pre-approval of those kinds of projects. And I believe that Hawaiian Electric in particular has judiciously used that to be able to move forward a lot of innovations in both technology and also others that involve better application of demand response and so on. So, with that, I'm very happy to go into more detail later in the discussion. And thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you, Mark. That's wonderful. And for the audience, you should recognize this idea of the annual open opportunity for utilities to engage in pilot programs like that. That is something that you'll hear about again from Connecticut in a minute. And also Vermont has implemented something rather similar. So that's one model for how to accelerate regulatory innovation that seems to really be catching on around the country. Next, we're going to hear from Commissioner Emil Thompson from the District of Columbia PSC. And I want to mention he was one of the presenters on this same topic at the NARUC meeting in Louisville, Kentucky that just took place. So this is a kind of a rerun of the information that he was presenting for us at that conference, along with commissioners from Oregon and Washington State. So today we have a different group of presentations about different jurisdictions, but we're building on the same topic about regulatory innovation and the pathways to regulatory innovation. Commissioner Thompson was appointed to the District of Columbia PSC by Mayor Muriel Bowser in 2021. And prior to that, he was an assistant United States attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. In the attorney's office, he worked on prosecuting homicides and as a deputy chief in the misdemeanor section. He has also served as a principal member of the DC Water Board of Directors since 2016. And while on the Water Board, he chaired the Human Resources and Labor Relations Committee and served on the Governance, Strategic Planning, and DC Retail Rates Committee. He's got an extensive career in the law, graduated from Morehouse College with a degree in computer science and minors in both math and biology, and then gained a law degree conferred from Wake Forest University School of Law. His special COVID pandemic activity has been the addition to his family of a new son who is now just 1 year old. Commissioner Thompson, welcome, and please go on with your presentation.
Again, thank you for having me, and thank you to NRRI for putting this panel together. I'm glad you had Hawaii go first. It's very clear from Mark's presentation that they do have a very extensive background in history in innovation, and it was wonderful to hear what they are doing there, some of which I was already familiar with, but some that it was also good to hear. Well, as some of you know, the district also has clean energy commitments, and they're very ambitious. By 2032, we have stated that all electricity that we use will come from renewable sources and that we will have zero greenhouse gas emissions. And so all of that and what goes into reaching those goals has really led us to work on innovation and become one of those hubs like Tom showed on one of his previous slides. I think it was the Clean Tech Hub slide where it showed that DC was number 6 in the nation. And that's all because we are trying to get to these goals. And one particular thing I would like to note about innovation, especially in the regulatory sense, is I believe it causes us to change our regulatory paradigm. Typically in years past, we would wait for our utilities, our traditional utilities to come before us with the proceeding, whether it's a rate or something else, and we would have to react to that. But as we start to look at the grid of the future and what's needed for the future, energy goals, and to address climate change, we have to be more proactive. So no more looking at the traditional grid and thinking of how it needs to look going forward. So in DC, we did that, right? We started in about 2015 with a proceeding called MEDSIS. It's been since renamed to Power Path DC, but really what it was our grid modernization proceeding. And when it first began, the first phase consisted of a number of town hall meetings, a great deal of stakeholder engagement. And what it really did was form the vision for Power Path, and it formed that vision, right? So it gave us the mission. It set a chart and a pathway forward and how we're going to move. And through that, 6 working groups were developed, as well as a governing board. Now, that governance board was and is responsible for reviewing, selecting, and overseeing innovation in accordance with that Power Path DC vision. Now, the governance board had a pot of about 21.55 million that was set aside from the merger of PEPCO, our local energy company, electricity company, with Exelon, and it had 21.5 million to use to select, identify, and ultimately implement different pilots. So the governance board is currently in that phase right now. They are in the process of finalizing the selection of the pilot projects and the RFP for the commission to review and then subsequently either propose changes or approve. In addition to the governance board, there were those 6 working groups that I mentioned. Those 6 working groups looked at a number of different areas and came up with a number of recommendations. I believe there were 32 recommendations to the commission. In the second bullet here, I've highlighted probably 3 of the larger ones. First, the formal case in which we are looking at energy storage and distributed energy resources and the regulatory construct around those and how that will work in the district. There's also another investigation into the regulatory framework of microgrids in the District of Columbia. And then finally, there was formal case 1130, which looked at non-wires alternatives. There's already been some implementation that is done as a result of that, especially around electric vehicles. Next slide, please. In addition to our main docket, Power Path that I mentioned earlier, there is also formal case 1160. Mark touched on this a little bit earlier about energy efficiency and demand response, but that's a very big thing in the district. So formal case 1160 established annual and long-term energy metrics, quantitative performance indicators, and cost-effective standards for our electric and gas companies, and really kind of in the area of energy efficiency and demand response. As a result of this, we've also asked that each of our utilities, gas and electric, go back and do a full inventory of their current energy efficiency and demand response programs, identify areas for growth, and submit proposal programs. That's forthcoming to the commission. And there's also a independent study that's being done as well with respect to that. Another case where we're really doing something different is formal case 1148, the whole building deep energy retrofit program. And that's to assist affordable multifamily building owners with energy efficiency. Now in DC, that's very important because of the way our jurisdiction is. It's a highly urban area. And unlike other states, we don't have rural areas, right? And we don't have suburban areas, really. It's all urban. So in the district, a lot of times you don't have new construction, especially in the residential sense, because there's not any additional land space, and it's very costly to tear down an existing structure and then rebuild. So this money, also funded by the PEPCO Exelon merger, but just in a different pot, sets aside 11.25 million to assist in affordable multifamily building owners to retrofit their buildings to meet today's energy standards. That is also another one in process. A vendor has been selected, and hopefully it's a 3-year project, and hopefully within next year we'll get our first report and hear the findings and the progress that has been made there. Finally, I just want to go back to our Clean Energy Act of 2018. I mentioned this earlier. Again, carbon neutrality by 2050, 100% renewable electricity by 2032. And so we have taken a very holistic approach to this. And when I say we, I mean the city. The legislature here, the DC Council, has implemented building standards. We are looking at transitioning vehicles to either clean or zero emission vehicles. And that's not only just personal usage, but also with our transit system, workforce development. We have a local academy here that's devoted to green infrastructure that each of the utilities participate in. And our Department of Energy is presently tracking 57 different tasks. And then the PSC itself has a dozen dockets, all addressing clean energy. Going back to our goal of 100% renewable electricity, again, the district is unique because, again, we're a highly urban area. So we don't generate within our borders in the traditional sense in terms of, traditional generation. And so we have to look to other places. But one of the things that the council set out was we have to have 10% by 2040 of our electricity come from solar within the district. And so we have been very creative about how to do that, whether that's residential programs with solar on top of residential roofs. We have CREFs, community renewable energy facilities, where individuals are allowed to subscribe to a larger solar system, solar generation system. Then we have Solar for All, which is a program for low-income residents to reap the benefits of solar as well. So we have a number of things we're doing in DC to really try and be innovative, a lot of different projects, some funded by money generated by the merger, some governmental money, but all trying to reach the goal of grid modernization, stabilization, resiliency, and meeting our clean energy goals. And with that, I will pass it on to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. It's very helpful to hear that experience and think about what might be especially relevant to urban areas and to cities and the process of managing these innovations in a city environment. Our next presenter is Joshua Ryer, who is Director of Utility Programs and Initiatives at the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. And as you will hear, Connecticut is deeply engaged in activities to try to promote and facilitate innovation in its utility realm. And Connecticut has what it calls a framework for an equitable modern grid, which is a major docket and set of dockets about grid modernization going on in Connecticut. Josh has a bachelor's degree in physics and economics from College of the Holy Cross and received a gold medal awarded for general excellence in physics. He also has a master's of science degree with distinction in sustainable energy systems from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, in addition to a certificate in financing and deploying clean energy from Yale University. Josh, welcome and thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Tom, and the NRRI team for putting this together and for inviting me to speak today. I'm honored to be on this panel with the other esteemed panelists that we have assembled here before us. So, like Tom said, my name is Josh Ryer. I'm the Director of Utility Programs and Initiatives at the Commission in Connecticut, and I'm going to talk about a docket that we actually currently have underway and has been open for a relatively short amount of time, as Tom mentioned at the top, of 2 years, and really walk through what our thinking is and where we're trying to go, and to kind of frame up our objectives. And I'll get into some more specific principles later. I actually want to touch on something that Commissioner Thompson mentioned earlier about thinking about how PUCs can set up processes and be more flexible and proactive in trying to achieve and making sure we achieve the aggressive clean energy and climate goals that each of our states have. So really the context to set for this document that I'm going to talk about is really acknowledging that we don't know the solutions to all of the problems or all of the things that are needed to get to those goals today, but rather we need to set in place a framework that's adaptable and frankly a little bit more nimble than we're used to in order to really take advantage of the solutions that come up later that we don't know about currently to help us reach our goals ultimately. So 3 quick caveats before I get into the presentation. One, you'll see there, my lawyers have asked me to mention that this should not be construed as legal advice. The second is that just a reminder, like I said, this is a proceeding that's still ongoing. So I'm going to talk about the proposal that's out there, not necessarily a final decision. And then the last is any comments are those of myself and not necessarily of the commission as a whole. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. So as kind of context for where we started. So I gave you kind of what we were trying to achieve at a very high level to start out with. Where we started, and we actually retained a consultant strategist about a little over a year ago, sorry, who has been absolutely fantastic. I promised a plug there. But one of the first places that we started with them was to look at what are the approaches that other states specifically, but also other jurisdictions internationally have taken in terms of setting up a process to encourage innovation and innovative solutions. And there's kind of 3 buckets that we saw: test beds, and I think we've heard, I'm sure everyone can think of an example of a test bed. And then kind of in the middle here, we have expedited pilot frameworks. I think of New York Rev Connect in that process. And then there's kind of this third bucket of regulatory sandboxes, which frankly in the US, there aren't a ton of. I think we heard a little bit about approach in Hawaii that would maybe be categorized as that. Tom already mentioned the Green Mountain Power example in Vermont. And really where we landed, as you'll see, is kind of somewhere between option 2 and 3. We can go to the next slide. So what we've kind of deemed the proposal or titled it is an innovations pilot framework. So that would suggest that it's kind of in that middle category. But then we tried to adopt some other elements of a regulatory sandbox, looking at not only what other commissions across the world are doing, but also taking learnings from the fintech industry. And so really the purpose, I already touched on that a little bit, at a high level, was creating this process to ensure that we are taking advantage of innovation that helps us reach our goals ultimately. And then more specifically, to support the goals of what Tom mentioned earlier, PURA's Equitable Modern Grid Framework, which actually has four objectives. And really, we're going to all target on those in a second when I talk about the principles. But also to make sure that we're taking advantage of and deploying high value solutions that, again, we might not in the current regulatory environment actually be set up to take advantage of. In terms of program structure too, I'm going to jump past participation pathways. We also tried to set up a program structure that was inclusive and lowered barriers to entry for innovative solutions. And I'll talk about that in a second. And to have this kind of program structure that overlaps, that allows us to not only learn from different cycles, but also to make sure that we're not just waiting for one cycle to end before we move to the next one. What I want to spend a couple of minutes on this slide is talking about the participation pathways. And this is one of the areas that we kind of drew from regulatory sandboxes in that first pathway that you'll see there, which is entirely EDC led. I think one of the examples that's kind of best illustrates types of projects that we'd expect to see here is actually PURA also currently has underway an investigation into low income rates, with some of our neighboring states have, and also economic development rates. So currently that proceeding is open. But I think this new framework actually would have provided an opportunity for the EDCs to propose solutions through this process and potentially actually get to testing those products much sooner than the longer regulatory process that we're undertaking to look at those two options currently. But it was also important for us as well to not just have kind of these partnerships. I'm jumping to the third one here, partnerships between the EDCs and third parties, which again, you see with the Rev Connect model, and the EDC-led projects, which again, I kind of associate with more of a regulatory sandbox approach. But it was also really important in our minds to have a framework that also had a space just for third-party developers to really create not only a market mechanism, or a market, I should say, but also to foster competition, between solution providers, whether it's a third party or the EDCs, but also to create an ecosystem that encourage these third parties to come to Connecticut, and then eventually, whether it's providing a solution on their own or with the EDCs, we then have brought them to the table, really. So we can go to the next slide. So you've already heard me talk about some of these design principles already. So after we talked about after we talked internally with Stratagen about what are the other approaches other states are taking, we then said, what are the principles that we're trying to design around? What are we trying to achieve here? And so we actually, about this time last year, released a strategic vision document for actually this process and what a potential framework could look like. And I've already talked about the diversity and market gap kind of principle. And really, to me, I think you could add in there lowering barriers to entry. But I want to touch on what's one of the key aspects of the equitable modern grid, and it's in the name, really is economic viability and equity. And it was important for us to think about that, not only in terms of, are there solutions that can help us bridge some of, and for those of you that are familiar with Connecticut, the economic divide and income is fairly stark in different parts of Connecticut. So what are solutions to maybe obviously we're not going to fix that problem, but what are some of our, what are the solutions to addressing inequity in Connecticut, but also in process? How do we make it a more inclusive process and a more transparent process? Obviously, for all commissions, transparency is important, but how do we make not only the process transparent, but the outcomes and the communications around what to expect transparent? I also want to talk about scalability. If you've heard our chairman speak about this program at all, and pilots in general, and you'll see it on the next slide, we talk about pilot-itis. We really aren't all that interested, to be frank, in just having a system that tests pilots and then doesn't do anything with them. We wanted to make sure we were setting up a framework that could scale pilots that are successful and could bring solutions and benefits more broadly, but also to say, no, we're not going to scale up, and to really minimize customer and ratepayer risk at that point, I should say. And then the last thing, I'll talk a little bit later about continuous learning as well, as that was one of the key guiding principles in program design. We can go to the next slide. Great, so we mentioned process and trying to make it more inclusive and more accessible, and creating this kind of ecosystem for innovation. So I like to almost think of, and the diagram that we probably should have put on this slide is more of a kind of a wedge that ramps up over time. Phase one is really focused on providing a platform for innovators to come in and to present to a council, an innovation advisory council, where we screen those ideas, but it's a relatively low barrier to entry, and it also is accompanied by some potential opportunities for innovators to speak with the EDCs or the commission to help further refine their idea. Phase two is really more of a little bit of a truncated process, but more of your traditional PURA process, where from phase one, there's recommendations that goes to the commission. And then in phase two, the commission asks for more detailed cost-benefit analysis and proposals, and then makes a decision on whether or not that pilot's going to be tested. In phase three, there's really the pilot is deployed, and the program administrator will actually kind of oversee and monitor the progress of that project. And then in phase 4, the innovator will actually provide a report. And then that's when the commission, with the recommendation of the advisory council that I mentioned earlier, that have key stakeholders like the Connecticut Green Bank and our Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and our Consumer Council, make a go, no-go decision at that point. And so that's really kind of the ramp and the 4 phases of the process that we're thinking that go into this framework. And then really almost a 5th phase would be how the project is scaled, which would likely have its own regulatory proceeding. We can go to the next slide. So some of the themes that you might have heard me say, and I've already had continuous learning and evolution before, and I have a slide on next. But again, it's fostering, when we were developing kind of that circle in the 4 phases, we were really thinking about lowering barriers to entry to foster an ecosystem of innovation, but then also take from really kind of the Silicon Valley approach to failing fast, right? If we're going to think about projects and the innovation and take a portfolio approach to the cost benefit of those projects, really what's key to that is cutting your losses early when it's clear that the project cannot be scaled. We can go to the next slide. Great, so this is just an illustration of the circle that I provided earlier in a linear fashion in the different phases. And then I mentioned earlier that there'll be a year 1, we'll kick off the ideation and screening process where the Innovation Council looks at and accepts proposals and makes recommendations. And then while that phase, or we called it an IPF cycle, because we all love our acronyms, while that's going on, the next cycle actually starts in that next year and continues. And what's important, and we can go to the next slide. So I'm finally going to get to the continuous education piece. So what's important and why is important for us to not only have the overlap of the cycles was so that we could actually be constantly learning from previous cycles when we're looking for and evaluating proposals that we get in phase 1, but also so that we can tailor the types of proposals that we're looking for, and that we're not just waiting for that 2-year process to go ahead, but we are still getting some of the benefits of what's going on and using those in the subsequent cycles. So what you probably missed, and it's hard to see in that previous slide, is that really we're thinking as we go, hopefully some of those phases, especially phase 1 and phase 2, will be able to be shortened as we get more accustomed to running those cycles. We also anticipate, as I mentioned earlier, it was really important to have a bucket just for third parties, but we really see that there's going to be hopefully more of a collaborative approach as we move on. And then again, I already mentioned that it'll be really important to incorporate the feedback, not only as the cycles progress into the next cycle, but at the very end of it, that we're thinking through any lessons learned, because in some cases, obviously, it might have been a good idea, but the application was off. So hopefully learning those nuances will be incredibly helpful to potentially, future other innovators that come into our process. We can go to the last slide. Great. Well, and with that, I just want to leave this slide for folks on the webinar today as well. Tom already mentioned the Equitable Modern Grid Framework, so there's a link there. And then all the process and the steps that we went through, it was a little bit different from other regulatory processes. All of the steps and links to the different straw proposals that we've put out are in this slide. So with that, I just want to thank Tom again for the opportunity today and look forward to the discussion with the panelists at the end.
All right, thank you, Josh. That's really great. And I think people are in the audience are starting to see the overall themes and draw some connections among the different activities that have taken place in all 3 jurisdictions that are similar in many ways. Next, we're going to hear from former Illinois Commerce Commission Chairman Brian Sheehan. And Brian has been one of the leading voices among state utility regulators about modernizing the infrastructure and promoting innovation. And it was actually a speech that I saw by Commissioner Sheehan that got me so interested personally in this subject, where I heard him talking in a forum in Chicago about some of the activities involved with innovation there, and thought this would be a great topic of more study. So we're going to invite Mr. Sheehan to give kind of an overview of these kinds of infrastructure ecosystems for innovation. And I want you to know that when he was chairman at the Illinois Commission, Illinois was rated #2 in the nation for its grid modernization activities by the Gridwise Alliance, and Smart Electric Power Alliance called Mr. Sheehan the Visionary of the Year, which is a pretty great title to have. Commissioner Sheehan, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that kind introduction and the opportunity to participate in the discussion. We've heard some excellent examples of fostering innovation. Joshua touched on the need to accelerate innovation. I wanted to focus on the case for the sandbox concept in particular. If we could have the next slide. In the coming years, we're really going to have to do even better as regulators and policymakers to integrate distributed resources and EVs and leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence while maintaining reliability, security, and affordability. In my view, a significant obstacle to developing these solutions is an ossified regulatory paradigm that actually disincentivizes innovation rather than encouraging it. Recently, industry leaders met at the National Clean Energy Week conference, where a consensus emerged that current technologies are frankly not up to meeting these challenges. We really need new tools that align our regulatory frameworks with today's technology rather than yesterday's. Next slide, please. For more than a century, reliable hub and spoke energy flow supported a steady growing demand for energy in familiar expected patterns. This system, its natural monopoly and independent state regulation, were conceived by Samuel Insull, who has been called the father of the electric utility industry in Chicago nearly 130 years ago, at a time when the horse and buggy still plied the streets of American cities. In fact, much of our approach to regulating utilities still reflects Insull's influence at the turn of the 19th century, from system design, utility economics, rate design, and the importance of scale, which Insull called massing production, years before the idea of mass production was attributed to Henry Ford. Can you imagine just for a minute what the Model T might look like today if Henry Ford had 130-year-old monopoly with no incentives for innovation? Would a Tesla or Lucid or Rivian even be conceivable? Incidentally, yesterday, Lucid's market cap exceeded Ford's for the first time. Rivian's is more than half again larger than Ford and is even larger than Volkswagen. Neither Lucid or Rivian have actually commercially produced vehicles yet. Tesla's market cap is about $1 trillion, more than 10 times greater than Ford, all evidence of the power of innovation. The effects of COVID and recent extreme weather events in Texas, California, and Europe have revealed just how vulnerable critical infrastructure is to disruptive events. And the confluence of a pandemic, climate and technological change, and evolving public opinion require that utilities and regulators reevaluate traditional assumptions about the signals utilities receive to pursue innovation. Next slide, please. Today's strong public sentiment towards addressing climate change creates a positive environment for investment in grid modernization and innovation. 2/3 of registered voters want to cut greenhouse gas emissions as a nation. 70% of Americans think global warming is real and will harm future generations. And 82% think there should be support for research into renewable sources of energy. The need to spur innovation is urgent, with the federal government pushing for most energy production to come from emission-free sources in the next decade, and 34 states implementing laws that will intensify the energy transition to clean sources. Energy and utility transformation is made more difficult, however, because utilities, which traditionally have conservatively invested in research and development, will have to invent and implement new and better ways to interconnect and utilize distributed energy and integrate new technologies. Next slide, please. If the economic regulation of natural monopolies is to simulate market forces, it's instructive to look at how their unregulated corporate peers behave, especially with respect to spending on research and development. A recent study by McKinsey and Company highlights the disparity by showing that private industry is way ahead of regulated utilities when it comes to investments in new technology. According to its study, the reinvestment of profits in basic research is highest for pharmaceutical and medical products at more than 50%, trailed by technology and communications at more than 40%, industrials 30%, and construction and infrastructure almost 20%. Only 3% of profits from electric power, oil, gas, and utilities are reinvested in R&D. In fact, the sector makes the lowest investments in R&D of all industries McKinsey surveyed. Other studies put utility investment at about 1% of revenue. Much of the regulatory framework today centers around the prudency of utility investments, with these judgments made after the fact, often years after the fact, with all of the risk placed squarely on utility shareholders. This is a disincentive to invest in innovation and actually harms customers rather than helps them. And it's not consistent with what we would expect to see by studying corporate behavior. Think for a moment about being on the board of directors of a company within the peer group. With industry averages between 12 and 50% of EBITDA spent on innovation, it would be imprudent not to invest significantly in research and development. An executive and board that spent 3% of EBITDA on R&D when competitors were spending an average of 30 would be guilty of gross mismanagement. They'd be fired. Their companies would not survive. Instead, boards have a fiduciary responsibility to insist on investments in research and development to create products and services that will benefit their customers. Regulators, therefore, in my view, have an obligation to ensure that utilities, in lieu of market forces, also make appropriate investments in R&D to meet the needs and expectations of their customers today and in the future. Anemic investment in R&D by utilities is actually imprudent. For the utility industry and its customers, the current regulatory process makes it virtually impossible to meet the pace of change they and we are facing. Next slide, please. One way we can accelerate R&D for utilities is to establish regulatory sandboxes, which Joshua touched on. They offer both regulated and unregulated organizations the ability to propose and test products or services, business models, or delivery mechanisms quickly and in a low-risk environment. Instead of pilots and trials that takes years to litigate, as Mark pointed out, are inflexible and slow to scale, we need to test new ideas quickly. And this is important. We need to scale successful solutions quickly. Next slide, please. Efforts to expedite innovation in highly regulated industries started with the financial technology or fintech businesses, but lately are also being introduced in other industries, including energy and utilities. This approach to addressing the stifling lag between technology innovation and regulatory alignment typically involves several common attributes. But the most important are open communication and collaboration between multiple stakeholders, small-scale rapid testing with low risk and low costs, building on past successes, and learning from and avoiding past failures. Learning has value. The most essential characteristics of the regulatory sandboxes are streamlining and expediting processes and procedures, flexibility, and the reduction of regulatory risk. Next slide, please. One of the first questions I get asked when talking to colleagues about the need to update regulatory frameworks is, who else is doing it? And it's a fair question. Being first is not always easy, especially in unconstructive political or editorial environments. But regulatory sandboxes are becoming the norm. According to World Bank, 57 jurisdictions globally have embraced 73 regulatory sandboxes as a means of providing a dynamic, evidence-based regulatory environment to test emerging technologies. Today, utility sandboxes exist in Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Singapore, and the UK, and are being planned for Austria and Australia. Generally, all sandboxes are geared towards the removal of barriers for projects that can enhance service quality, cost efficiency, or system resiliency by reducing regulatory uncertainty and risk to encourage innovation that benefits customers. Improving customer service and value is the reason to encourage utility and innovation. Creating a widely adopted regulatory framework by state public utility commissions that encourages experimentation and investment in new and emerging technologies is urgently needed to responsibly, and I would argue prudently, manage the rapidly evolving climate and technological challenges we face. That's the conclusion of my presentation. Tom, thanks again for the invitation to participate, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you. Now, if we can get all the presenters to come back on their video, we'll start with the Q&A session and discussion. And audience, we invite you to send your questions through the Q&A tab on your Zoom menu. We already received a couple. First one came in for Josh, and I want to ask all the states or all the presenters to think about their answer to this same question, which is, how can we facilitate access by third parties to these processes without putting the utility in the role as a gatekeeper who might prevent otherwise valuable innovations from coming to the fore? Josh, let's start with you and then maybe go backwards and see what the presenters have to say.
Sure, happy to take that on. So I think that's really the focus of phase 1 and 2 that I went over. Phase 1 really, so we're going to create this innovation advisory council and have an event that kicks off that, and we provide information to stakeholders on that. And then all of the applications are going to come to that committee as a whole. And everyone on that committee has one vote. We have 2 EDCs, and thank you, Tom, for explaining that it's electric distribution companies. That's the term we use in Connecticut. We'll have 1 vote each as well. And then that will be a recommendation to PURA. And then PURA will take that away, and then we will make a decision, and we will direct the utilities to enter into a contract or an agreement for these pilots for very specific terms. So that's the approach that we've taken.
Emil, Mark, do you have a comment on the same question or the same issue?
Yes, I think one of the things that we have working in our favor is in 2 instances I mentioned, we had money that was set aside for merger commitments. So when you take the funding aspect away from the utilities, you then and it's kind of take away their big strength, right? And so they then become equal to all the other stakeholders. And so especially with respect to the Power Path DC, we took the money away. Well, the money is with the the commission is an escrow. And so we are the final arbiter of where it goes. Now, of course, Pepco is in Washington Gas, they are in the decision-making process, but they're not driving it. And they have the same say that all the other participants have. And so I think that helps level the playing field when you start talking about some of these pilot projects that buck the traditional trend of what utilities like to do. And so that's the approach we've taken in DC. It'll be interesting to see what happens once we run out of that pilot money.
I think that's a good point to maybe talk about just for a second. I think, most jurisdictions probably have examples of programs that are funded as a result of merger conditions, and Illinois certainly has those, or are the product of a legislative process. And Illinois has stakeholder guided incubators that have been funded in the past. And there certainly are some successes that emerge from those. But I think to really create something more durable, we need to think about how you align the interests of consumers and the utility. If it's a zero-sum game, then you're always going to get resistance, and it's really going to delay the opportunities for innovation. I've talked about leveling the playing field between different types of software technologies so that the economics don't disadvantage an on-prem from a SaaS-based application. That could be one way, for example. But I think that making sure that it's not a zero-sum game, and that the interests of the consumers and the utility, frankly, are aligned is the way to create a more durable path to change.
Mark, do you want to add something right now?
Well, I just have a kind of a follow-up question for Brian. A key point, again, getting back to this investment issue, what would it take, do you think, for commissions to feel more comfortable in allowing, I guess, a greater amount of investment to come from utilities, regulated utilities, for innovation? Is that part of the bottleneck?
Well, I think the point I was trying to make in terms of public opinion is that, public opinion and certainly, as it's reflected in public policy by governors and legislatures, seems to argue for support for innovation and these investments. I think it's going to be necessary. The industry historically, rate-based contributions to EPRI, for example, and for whatever reason has gotten away from that. Some states, we've talked about a couple of examples today, have decided to just allocate sort of pots of money for innovation. That certainly could be an approach, but I think it requires a recognition from policymakers and regulators that innovation is going to be required to maintain a reliable, resilient grid with really high levels of penetration from renewables that are in turn required to meet other social goals. So I think there's a strong case for it. As a former regulator, I can speak with some authority on the discomfort at being criticized in the press and elsewhere over your decisions, but it really requires that regulators and policymakers, have some courage and explain their rationale for making tough decisions. There is a cost to all of this, and I think it's okay to talk about the cost. I think it's justifiable. And as I pointed out in my presentation, I think the lack of investment in innovation is actually imprudent. You're not protecting consumers. You know, with a lot of this, there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction among consumer advocates to, just prevent any kind of spending that might make a utility money. And it's really short-sighted, I think. So I think it just really requires some leadership and courage. And there are some excellent examples of that on the panel today. And that's really what it takes. Some good examples, and then people get more comfortable with joining that group, if you will.
Okay, very good. We did get a second question, which is about consumer data and consumer privacy in this context. Maybe we'll ask each of you if you also want to address that idea. What is it that your state is doing to help make certain that the innovations can take place, but individual consumer data can be protected and consumers' right to privacy can be protected during the process? Have you got any particular insights into that?
Well, Illinois, has been a leader on this for quite a long time. The commission has had docketed proceedings on consumer data. It's regarded as the consumer's data. They can opt into programs that make it available to particular vendors. It is available on a anonymized basis. And there have been a number of groups who have used that successfully to make a case for various rate structures and so forth. So Illinois certainly would be a good state to look at in terms of, striking that balance between having it available, making it available in a useful format, and protecting the interests of consumers.
Anybody else want to chime in?
I'll speak very briefly to it. In DC, that's been something we've been looking at as well. I think the utilities, the customers themselves have access to their data, but the big question in DC is third parties and what access should they or should they not be granted. One of the issues that we're running into is typically the commission doesn't control these third parties. And so how do we ensure that they are following the same standards that we're holding everybody else to? And so that's an ongoing discussion, and we're trying to figure that out. Because I think to that person's question, I think it was Lisa. I mean, when we really start talking about energy efficiency, some of the things we can do, other people need to look at this data so that we can come up with innovative ways to address these issues.
And I can talk briefly about our approach in this proposal that I talked about today was, and actually all of, we've authorized storage programs, new renewable energy tariff programs recently. All of them have data access and privacy plans within the programs. And then we're also currently reviewing proposals for statewide deployment of AMI. And so that we're also using that as an opportunity to take a holistic view on all of those plans to make sure they're consistent. And that they're up to snuff in terms of best practices. But then in terms of this actual program, one of the interesting approaches that we're taking in phase one, actually before phase one, is we're asking 60 days before phase one starts for both utilities to provide to innovators and, well, just publicly, a grid needs assessment and then a customer needs assessment to give some of that data and information at an aggregate level. We'll see if that is, and to the question, if that's enough for solutions providers to then design their solutions. But I think it's a helpful in between step to at least give some information to entrepreneurs at that stage.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, if you would start showing the remaining slides as we go here, just maybe put each one on the screen for 30 seconds or so the audience can see them. You'll see both references to some of the best reports and studies that I've found on these topics, including the ones co-authored by Mr. Glick and one authored by Commissioner Sheehan. And then you'll also see announcements of forthcoming events from NRRI and from the NARUC CPI, Center for Programs and Innovations. which is part of NARUC, and they are also holding a series of particular innovations discussions. As we're doing that, I wanted to raise one more question. I think we have time for this. And that is, just in the last week, we've seen the conclusion of the Conference of Parties for the 26th annual meeting in Glasgow, and they reached some decisions about global climate action. And we've also seen the bipartisan infrastructure bill pass in Washington. And I know both of those activities might have influence on both the need for innovation and the topics that will be addressed for innovation. I wonder if any of the presenters have a response yet, or early on, I know, but do you have ideas about how those kinds of changes are going to flow through into your activities regulating not just the electric industry, but natural gas and water and wastewater utilities as well? Anyone?
Tom, I think they really represent some of the large trends that we've seen, in the last few years, and are exciting. I think, with maybe just a few caveats, and they would be that integrating, the scale of distributed resources that we're talking about is wickedly complicated and difficult, and doing it in a way that maintains, nearly 100% reliability, which our modern society demands more than ever, is going to be a big challenge and an expensive challenge. And so while I think it's important that we focus on making improvements to the way we generate electricity and the way we transport electricity and the way we consume it, I think it's important to keep in mind that many of the innovations required to keep the system stable and reliable will come at the distribution level. And we can't lose sight of the importance of that. And it's certainly going to be an expensive endeavor. But I think all of the data points that you just touched on argue loudly for, what we've talked about today, which is finding new ways to innovate, finding better ways to innovate, and state public service commissions and utility commissions are going to be at the center of that debate.
Any final remarks from presenters? We're getting ready to hit our closing time, but we want to give you a chance for anything that maybe you didn't get to say yet.
Well, Tom, just on that last topic, Hawaiian Electric did come out with a pretty firm statement. It sort of jumped on the bandwagon on COP26, but it did make a meaningful statement about trying to reduce to 70% over, I don't know, it was 1990 levels of their carbon footprint, which would require more renewable portfolio. Basically, they would have to improve upon their renewable portfolio standard law. They'd have to exceed it by 2030 to hit that 70% mark. So, positive things. I think that, FERC for the rest of the nation probably is going to try to provide some leadership on continue to discuss carbon pricing and other things. And I think it's going to be important for that to happen at a national level for us to make considerable, progress there.
I would just say, I think this is a topic where we could probably spend so much time talking about various things. Earlier when we had a discussion about, how do you take pilot projects away from the utilities, and I spoke for a second about the money aspect, and then Brian talked about harmonizing or bringing into unity everybody's same goal points, right? And that had me thinking about performance incentive mechanisms, decoupling, and all these notions that really play a part in creating that ultimate buy-in to creating that innovative workspace where people are all working towards the same goal. And so I think I've enjoyed being on here. Definitely some takeaways, some things to think about. And so I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, I'm not going to try and follow up any of those concepts. I just thank you. I appreciate the time and learning from all of you. I look forward to following the progress that all of these states and others make and reading Commissioner Sheehan's articles.
Okay, thank you all. We really appreciate your time today, and audience. Thank you for joining us. Again, I invite you to send me information about what activities are going on in your state so that we can get them included in our forthcoming research report. And we look forward to these next opportunities that you saw on your screen for the regulatory training initiative classes that are coming up in December and January, and then for those forthcoming NARUC webinars. Audience, thank you very much for joining us today. Presenters, you did a great job, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do all the work to get ready for today and to keep this conversation going. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.